Okay, class, welcome back to Biological Basis. This is still 2A. We are particularly going to be looking at neurotransmitters in this section. This is kind of questioning, how do other neuron cells communicate with other neuron cells? So how do these two cells communicate together? Let's kind of recap where we've been. So first thing we looked at was the neuron. You should know all the basic structures of the neuron. I want to make myself clear. The myelin sheath, okay, if you're lacking the myelin sheath, it could lead to things like multiple sclerosis, which usually attacks a person's immune system. Okay, so you get diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. It could attack the person's immune system, which could lead them to other types of illnesses. And then the second thing we looked at is we looked at neural transmission. So how do different neurons personally send messages? We looked at the resting potential, the action potential. So you should be familiar with those two sections so far. So let's move on to kind of what we're talking about today. How neuron cells communicate with one another. Basic vocab you should already know, but neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals released from the sending neuron. So those were our nerds in the demo from class. They travel across the synapse and bind to receptor sites on the receiving neuron. So receptors are what pick up the different neurotransmitters. So you have your picture here. This is the sending neuron. Okay. This is the action potential occurring, the firing, sending the message. This is the little vessel containing the neurotransmitters. Alright, so we have the axon terminal. They're leaving the axon. They cross over through this gap, which pretty much there's nothing there. It's called the synaptic gap. Okay, and then they bind to the receptor sites on the receiving neuron. And this is probably the dendrites will pick them up. Okay, so they still uncover their. One thing you do need to know is what the synapse is, and I know we skimmed the surface on this. The synapse is the junction between the axon tip of the sending neuron and the dendrite or the cell body of the receiving neuron. This tiny gap is called the synaptic gap or cleft. So we talked about this before. Okay, if you look at our picture again, the synaptic gap is right here. So let's look a little bit closer up at neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are natural chemicals that help impact normal behavior. The body produces chemicals that help manage hunger, energy, hallucination, cognition, and emotion. Neurotransmitters are key components for all behavior in our mental process. The neurotransmitters, you may see NT sometimes for short, carry the messages for all that we do. Neurotransmitters send messages to be happy or sad, to move or stay still. Neurotransmitters can function differently depending on where they are located in the nervous system. Scientists are still discovering how these chemicals work. So, you should be aware that the information in this unit is no way a definite answer. They're finding out new things about neurotransmitters all the time, thanks to science. So let's look at each one individually, or the ones that you're going to be responsible for knowing. First one, ACH, acetylcholine. This was the first neurotransmitter ever detected. It helps us with movement. Okay? It impacts our memory. If we lack this neurotransmitter, okay, it could cause us to have Alzheimer's. Like I said before, it allows us to move. If this transmission is blocked, we can become paralyzed, so it could be really serious. An example of something that is a drug that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but a drug that may block acetylcholine is Botox. Another neurotransmitter is dopamine. Dopamine is responsible for movement, attention, emotion, and learning. It's often known for controlling our reward and pleasure centers in our brain. Lacking this neurotransmitter could lead to tremors, which can lead to Parkinson's. So if you're lacking it, your body is starved of it. Okay, it can lead you to have a negative downfall. And if you have an excess amount of it, okay, it can lead for you to kind of start hallucinating, seeing things that aren't necessarily there, which is schizophrenia. A similar drug that kind of, I would say, copies this neurotransmitter is the addictive drug cocaine. Serotonin. Serotonin is involved with mood regulation. It affects our mood, our hunger, our sleep, and our arousal. Again, there's appetite, mood, sleeping, arousal, and pain. Low levels of this can make us sad, anxious, or depressed. Undersupply can lead to depression. The drugs that help raise the levels, often known as Zoloft, Paxil, Prozac. And another drug that can kind of heighten your awareness here is LSD and ecstasy. So gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, impacts sleep and motor control. An excess amount can lead to abnormal functioning with seizures, insomnia, and anxiety. So you can't fall asleep and maybe you're potentially anxious. The drug that interferes with this is alcohol interferes with this. Glutamate. Glutamate impacts your memory. An oversupply can lead to migraines or seizures. Endorphins are natural painkillers. They're similar to morphine. Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine increases our alertness, leads to physical arousal, and involved in wakefulness. It's very active in the amygdala. Low levels can lack attention, depression, and loss of memory. A drug that can impact this is Adderall. It can impact your heart rate and blood pressure as well. So I would highly suggest maybe you pause. This is the chart that's found on page 57 in your textbook. You might want to make sure you have all the vocabulary, the functions, and the examples of malfunctions. If there's an excess or lacking this neurotransmitter, you will be responsible for understanding how these apply to a case. So Katie has been really sad lately. She is not eating. She's not sleeping. What neurotransmitter might she be having a problem with? If you could look at this list, you'd probably be able to apply serotonin to this one. So in class, we will be looking at case studies, so you need to be pretty confident on the different neurotransmitters. Prescription drugs each neurotransmitter has a similar drug to help balance if it's unbalanced. So if you're lacking a neurotransmitter, they may give you a drug to help boost that function in your body. Taking illegal or non-prescription drugs disrupts the balance of normal levels. So if you are taking illegal drugs, that can block the ability of the normal neurotransmitters to kind of send the messages in the correct way. So for an example, if the neurotransmitter is blocked It could cause things like for you to forget certain things or start hallucinating in certain ways. In order for drugs to have an effect on the body, there must be an accompanying receptor site on a neuron that matches the structure. So in order for the drug really to work, the receptor's got to be able to detect it. And I'm talking more along the line of prescription drugs versus illegal drugs, because illegal drugs are probably going to do more harm to your body. Okay, so the first thing is looks for with prescription drugs is they try and find a lock and key mechanism. So neurotransmitters bind to the receptors of the receiving neuron in a lock and key mechanism. So the neurotransmitter here is going to attach itself to the receptor, and it's going to match perfectly. Okay, the neurotransmitter molecule has a molecule structure that precisely fits the receptor site on the receiving neuron, much like a key fits in a lock. Okay, so these little neurotransmitters have no problem attaching itself to the receptor. So let's talk about prescription drugs. There's two types of prescription drugs you could have. You could have an agonist or an antagonist. An agonist here is very similar to the neurotransmitter. Almost perfect lock and key here. Okay? It tries to replicate the neurotransmitter. Some of it creates a positive high and relief. Others, if there's too much of it, could produce harm. So this agonist molecule excites it. It's similar enough in structure to the neurotransmitter molecule that it mimics its effect on the receiving neuron. Endorphins help relieve pain for us. In order for us to if we're lacking in, let's say, endorphins, or we need more of it because we're going through a surgery, morphine, for instance, mimics the actions of endorphins, releasing that pleasure or releasing that, or taking care of the pain by stimulating the receptors in the brain areas involved in mood and pain sensations. Antagonist, okay, they're antagonizing you, they're being mean to you, they're blocking you, okay, that's the neurotransmitter that blocks the ability from entering, okay, blocks the neurotransmitter, can cause victim to become paralyzed, can cause harm to them. This antagonist molecule inhibits. It is a structure similar enough to a neurotransmitter to occupy its receptor site, but it blocks its action, but not similar enough to stimulate the receptor. Okay, so like I said before, blocking this can cause problems with muscles. An example of this would be Botox. Right, you're not allowing that movement, the acetylcholine, to cause the movement to take place, which is going to cause you to become paralyzed or paralyze that area. Okay, so this is the end of neurotransmitters. By the end of this presentation, you should be pretty comfortable with the different neurotransmitters. You should be able to identify how they can impact your functions, and if you have an excess amount or you're lacking a certain amount, how that can impact your behavior. You should also know the difference between different types of drugs you can have that mimic neurotransmitters, agonist versus antagonist. We will be applying these in class.